They took the house. They took the accounts. They took 60 acres of mountain land. They shook hands over it before the funeral flowers had even wilted. And they left Nora Vance a leaning cabin nobody had opened in 3 years, sold to her for $1. A joke at her own grandmother's will reading. Uncle Garrett laughed so hard he dropped the house keys. $41 sat in her checking account. A lawyer slid a folded deed across a table, like it was a napkin. She said, "Thank you." She meant something else entirely. 3 weeks later, she pried a stone loose from behind a cold hearth. Her fingers found metal that should not have been there. Rusted tin. A key. An envelope. Her grandmother's handwriting on the front. 4 words. Words that would end up worth $4 million to men who didn't know it yet. But before the stone, before the tin, there was the laughing. "Let me take you back to the Tuesday it started." The lawyer slid the folded deed over. He said one word. Cabin. Nora's uncle laughed so hard he dropped the house keys, just handed to him minutes before. Nora had $41 to her name. Her grandmother was 3 weeks gone, and Nora took the joke. She was 27 years old. She'd learned, a long time ago, how to hold her face still, even when a room wanted her to break. She held it still now. A windowless conference room. Second floor of a law office in Caudle's Gap, North Carolina. A portrait of somebody's dead partner watched from the wall. The air conditioning fought a losing war against July. "The cabin," the lawyer said again. Like she hadn't heard him the first time. His name was Denny Ash. He had a habit of pushing his glasses up his nose right before he delivered something unpleasant. Like the motion braced him for it. Nora had known him her whole life, the way you know the person who reads your electric meter. Present at every important town moment. Invisible otherwise? For $1, he added. Like the number needed saying twice. Her Uncle Garrett Vance leaned back so far his chair complained under him. He was 58, thick through the shoulders even now. A face that had spent 3 decades deciding what other people's work was worth, and always landing on less than they'd hoped. Tivam, he held up the ring of keys Ash had just passed him. The good keys, the ones to the house on Persimmon Street, where Opal Vance had lived 40 years. He let them dangle off one finger. $1. Garrett started to laugh. It came from his chest, not his throat. Ugly. Comfortable. A sound like he'd practiced it. Mama really did that. She really left the girl a shack for $1. Beside him, his son Tyler smirked into his coffee. Tyler was 31. He worked in something to do with logistics, though he explained it differently every time somebody asked. Brett, the younger cousin, was 26 and still living in Garrett's basement. He didn't bother hiding his laugh at all. It bounced off the framed diplomas on the wall. The keys slipped off Garrett's finger. They hit the table. One bounced onto the carpet. Nobody but Nora moved to pick it up. "Well," Ash said, into the noise, "the cabin, and the 1.25 acres it sits on. Sorrel Mountain Parcel, off Beetree Road. The cabin." Garrett wiped his eye. Mama's little joke. Should have known she'd have one more in her. Nora sat with her hands folded on the table, the way she'd learned to sit in rooms like this one. She did not raise her voice. She had exactly $41 in her checking account. Voice raising had never once put money back into an account. Not in her whole life. Not in anyone's. She watched the keys glint on the carpet under the fluorescent light. She thought about her grandmother's hands, how they'd shaken those last months, how they'd never once let go of anything they meant to hold on to. "Congratulations," Garrett said. He meant the opposite. Everybody at that table knew it. She looked at the deed in front of her. 1 page, her name typed at the top, Nora Elaine Vance. Below it, the parcel description, in a font too small for anything that mattered. Under that, in Denny Ash's own hand, a note. Sale price, $1 per grantor's written instruction. Read every line. Opal used to tell her that. Back when Nora was small enough to sit on the porch steps, not understanding why an old woman cared so much about paperwork. "I didn't leave you the cabin, child. I left you the water." Read every line. Nora had thought it was one of Opal's sayings. Opal had 100 of them. Little riddles she dropped like seeds in a garden she wouldn't live to see bloom. Nora had never once asked what it meant. Now Opal was 3 weeks in the ground at Mount Olivet Baptist. There was no one left to ask. "We'll get the estate account squared by Friday." Ash was talking to Garrett now. He slid a different stack of papers across. The real stack. The house, the CDs, 60 acres of timber and pasture running along Bee Tree Road below the cabin. Garrett's copy was thick as a phone book. Nora's copy was one page. And the acreage, Garrett said. Not quite a question. Already in escrow, like we discussed. Century Ridge's people want to close by September. Ash said it like routine. Like nothing. To him, it probably was. Nora didn't know the name Century Ridge yet. She'd learn it soon enough. Learn to say it the way you learn the name of a storm that took your roof. She stood up when the meeting ended. That's what you did. She shook Ash's hand. That's what you did. She did not shake her uncle's hand. There are limits, even to what a person owes a room. You planning on living up there? Tyler asked her in the parking lot, grinning like the question was a kindness. Might want to bring a flashlight. Pretty sure the last time anybody turned the power on up there was when Nixon was in office. Might want to bring a shovel too, Brett added. Bury whatever's left of your pride. She got in her car, a 2011 Corolla, 190,000 miles on it. A check engine light that had been on so long it had become part of the dashboard's personality. She drove. She did not cry until she was 2 miles down Route 19. Then she let herself do it, exactly as long as it took to pass the Baptist church. That had been her rule since she was 14. You get from here to there, then you're done. Then you fix your face and keep going. Bee Tree Road climbed out of the valley in switchbacks, past a spring the old maps called Polly's Spring, past a stand of sorrel-coloured maples that gave the mountain its name. It ended at a cabin closed up since the last time Opal's knees allowed the drive. Nora parked in the weeds where a driveway used to be. The porch sagged on the right side, like a shoulder that had given up holding itself square. The door stuck. She had to put her hip into it. 90-year-old wood groaned around a lock that hadn't turned smooth in a decade. Inside it smelled like dust and cold ash. Something green tried to get in through the north wall. A stone hearth took up most of one side of the single main room. A cot sat in the back corner, a quilt over it that Nora recognised, one Opal's own mother had pieced. A window looked out over Polly's Spring, where the water still ran clear and steady. Indifferent to inheritance, indifferent to lawyers, indifferent to everything but gravity. She had $41. She had a car that might not survive another Charlottesville back trip for temp agency work that had dried up in June. She had a cabin nobody wanted, and a phrase in her head she didn't understand yet. I didn't leave you the cabin, child. I left you the water. Read every line. She built a fire that night, dead branches off the porch, more for the company of the light than the July heat. She sat cross-legged in front of the hearth, eating a granola bar that had to count as dinner. Looked at that hearth a long time. Not because anything about it seemed wrong yet, just because it was the only thing in the room that looked like it had ever loved anybody back. She didn't know it yet, 3 feet from where she sat, behind a stone mortared, in slightly wrong on purpose, 40 years earlier. An old woman had left her the only inheritance that would ever actually matter. It would take Nora another 11 days to find it. It would take the rest of the county another 6 weeks to understand what she'd found. For now, she just watched the fire. She thought about her grandmother's hands. She went to sleep on a cot, under a quilt older than her mother, in a cabin worth exactly $1. On the only piece of ground in 3 counties, nobody in her family had bothered to actually read. The next morning she woke to birds and a stiff neck, a strange stubborn feeling she refused to name as hope. Because hope had cost her before. She made coffee on a camp stove she'd borrowed from a co-worker who felt sorry for her. She carried the cup out onto the sagging porch. She looked down the mountain, at Bee Tree Road disappearing into the trees, out the spring glinting below, where the morning sun found gaps in the canopy. 40 years earlier, Opal Vance had stood on this same porch with a young surveyor named Hollis Pruitt. She'd pointed her cane at that spring like it was the only thing in the world worth protecting. Nora didn't know that yet either. She only knew her coffee was going cold. Somewhere down the mountain, her Uncle Garrett was already on the phone, a man from a company called Century Ridge, confirming a closing date. He was confident the girl on the mountain had gotten exactly what she deserved. Nothing. He was wrong about that. He just didn't know it for 6 more weeks. Nora finished her coffee. She went back inside. She wanted to see what, if anything, could be salvaged. A life that had just handed her a leaning roof, a locked door, and a $sign where a family should have been. She did not know the cabin held a secret. She only knew the hearth needed cleaning if she meant to cook anything in it. And cleaning was a thing her hands knew how to do, even when her heart didn't know what came next. She knelt at the hearth. She pulled out old ash with a bent trowel she'd found in a rusted coffee can by the door. That was when her knuckles first brushed a stone that gave, just slightly, under pressure. Every other stone in that hearth held firm as the mountain itself. She didn't think anything of it. Not that morning. She had a fire to lay, a roof to inspect, a life to somehow rebuild on $41. An old loose stone in an old cold hearth was the least of 100 small problems waiting on her that day. But her hand remembered it. Hands do that. They file things away long before the mind catches up. She wiped the ash from her palms. She looked out at the spring one more time. She got up to see what else this dollar had bought her. 60 miles away, in a glass office building, a company called Century Ridge Development finalized paperwork on 60 acres that would be worthless within 2 months. Not one person in that building understood it yet. Not her uncle in his kitchen. Not Denny Ash in his law office. The whole deal was already dead, sitting quiet and patient, behind a loose stone, in a cabin they'd handed away as a punchline. Read every line, Opal had said. Nora hadn't yet, but she would. The first week on Sorrel Mountain taught her what $41 actually bought a person. Less than she'd have guessed. She spent $6 of it on candles at the Dollar General in town because the cabin had no power and wasn't getting any soon. She spent $9 on a gallon of stove fuel. She kept the rest folded into a coffee can on the windowsill. She counted it most nights, the way you check on a wound. Not because the number changed, because looking at it felt like doing something. She found work fast. She had to. Caudle's Gap had one diner, the Sorrel Cafe. The woman who ran it, Patsy Duncan, needed somebody for the breakfast shift, starting at 5 in the morning. Cash under the table, $9 an hour, and whatever she could carry home in a to-go box. Nora took it without a single follow-up question. She'd learned that too a long time ago. When somebody offers you a rope, you don't inspect it for fray marks. You climb. You're Opal's girl, Patsy said, that first morning, sizing her up over the register. Granddaughter, Nora said. I know what you are. Patsy wiped her hands on her apron. Opal used to come in here every Sunday after church. Ordered the same thing for 40 years. 2 eggs over medium, wheat toast, coffee black. She'd leave a dollar tip even when a dollar tip was an insult, just so the girls would remember her kindly. She looked at Nora a long moment. You look like her around the eyes. Same steady thing. It was the first kind word anyone in that town had said to her since the funeral. Nora had to turn around and pretend to check the coffee filters, so Patsy wouldn't see what it did to her face. She worked the breakfast shift 6 mornings that first week, drove the Corolla up and down Beatree Road, the check engine light glowing its steady orange complaint. Came home each afternoon to a cabin that was, slowly, starting to look like somewhere a person could actually live. She swept. She scrubbed the one window until the glass gave up its film of 40 years' dust and let real light in. She patched the worst gap in the roof with a blue tarp and a roll of duct tape from the hardware store. She weighed it down with stones carried up from the spring one at a time, because renting a truck cost money she didn't have. On the 4th evening, coming back from the spring with an armful of flat stones for the roof, she found an envelope wedged into the crack of the front door. No stamp, no return address, just her name, Nora, in handwriting she didn't recognise. Careful, a little shaky. Like whoever wrote it had taken their time. Inside was a $20 bill, a single line on a scrap of notebook paper. Your grandmother fixed my truck's transmission for free in 1996 and never once mentioned it again. This isn't much. Welcome home. No signature. Nora stood on the porch with the 20 in her hand, the light going gold behind Sorrel Mountain. She cried for the second time since the will reading. This time she didn't stop herself after 2 miles of road, because there was no road. There was just the porch, and the spring running below it, and a stranger's $20 bill that felt heavier than anything Garrett had walked away with. She never found out who left it. She kept the scrap of paper anyway, folded small. In the coffee can with the money, Nora had been the one who drove up to Opal's house on Persimmon Street every single Sunday for 9 years. Through college and after. Through the 2 years she'd spent in Charlotte, chasing a job that fell apart along with the company that offered it. Through every broke, uncertain season of her 20s. She never missed a Sunday. Not for weather. Not for exhaustion. Not for the handful of boyfriends who complained she spent every weekend with an old woman instead of with them. She knew which porch step groaned loud enough to wake Opal from her afternoon nap, and always skipped it climbing up. She knew Opal took her coffee black, except on her birthday, when she allowed herself cream and sugar both, calling it her one permitted vanity. She kept, folded in her wallet even now, a pair of Opal's reading glasses, the ones with the chipped corner. Opal had pressed them into her hand the week before she died and said only, "Keep these somewhere safe." Nora had assumed at the time it was simply the wandering request of a tired old woman. She hadn't understood, until much later, it was itself another small piece of the same long, careful plan. Garrett had visited his mother 4 times in those same 9 years, always around a holiday, always for under an hour, always managing to mention, before he left, some way his own life required more of Opal's attention than a Sunday afternoon visit ever quite delivered. Tyler and Brett had visited even less. None of it had ever seemed to Nora like a strategy. It had simply seemed like love offered without calculation, the only kind she knew how to offer anybody. It was only now, sitting in a cabin with a brass key on a shoelace around her neck, that she understood something. Her grandmother might have been counting those Sundays too. Quietly. The way she counted everything, filing each one away as evidence toward a conclusion she'd reached long before Nora ever thought to wonder whether loyalty like that got noticed at all. It was Hollis Pruitt who found her on the 8th day, though it might be more honest to say she found him. He was standing at the bottom of her weed-choked driveway with a thermos, a look on his face, like a man revisiting a memory he wasn't sure he wanted back. "You're not supposed to be able to get a truck up this road anymore," he said, by way of hello. "Last I did it was 1988. He was 71, narrow through the shoulders, the kind of tan that comes from 40 years outdoors, not any vacation." His hands shook slightly now, when they weren't doing something useful. He'd been the county surveyor for 31 years before he retired. Before that, he'd been the young man Opal Vance hired in 1986. He ran the lines on this exact parcel, back when Sorrel Mountain was still just land nobody wanted, back when Beatree Road was barely a road at all. "I'm Hollis," he said. "I knew your grandmother. Ran her surveys. Thought I'd come see how her girl was getting on, since nobody else in this county seemed inclined to ask." Nora offered him what she had. Well, water in a jelly jar. He drank it like the finest thing anyone had handed him in years. He sat on the porch steps she hadn't fixed yet, looking out at the spring. "Opal made me survey this parcel 3 separate times," he said. "Most people, you run the lines once and you're done. She had me come back in 86, then again in 91, then one more time in 94. Her knees went bad enough she couldn't climb up here anymore. Wanted every line checked and checked again. I asked her once why she cared so much about an acre, and a quarter nobody was fighting over." He shook his head slowly. She said, "Hollis, someday somebody's going to fight over it plenty. I want the paper to be so clean nobody can pretend not to see it." Nora felt something cold and sharp move through her chest. The first real edge of a thing that would take weeks yet to fully surface. "What paper?" "The deed," Hollis said. "Opal made me write it twice so no lawyer could pretend not to see it. Recorded it herself down at the courthouse in 86. Paid the fee out of her own purse. Never told a soul what it actually said, near as I could tell. I always figured it was about the spring." He nodded down the slope toward the water running clear over stone. "That's Polly's spring, only reliable water source on this whole side of the mountain. Your grandmother used to say a mountain's spring belongs to whoever holds the paper on it, not whoever holds the prettiest house." Nora sat very still. Down the mountain, her uncle's 60 acres of timber and pasture ran along Beatree Road below this exact spot. Acres already signed over in escrow to a company called Century Ridge. Acres that would need water and a road to close any kind of deal at all. "You still have those old survey plats?" she asked him. "Somewhere in a box in my garage." He looked at her sideways, the look of a man deciding whether a thing was worth saying out loud yet. "Your grandmother was smarter than every one of your uncles put together. Every one of them mistook her quiet for simple. That was always their first mistake." He stood knees cracking and set the jelly jar down on the step. "I'll bring the plats by this weekend. Might be nothing. Might be everything. Your grandmother didn't do anything twice unless it mattered 3 times over. He left her alone on the porch, the spring running below her, a phrase turning over and over in her mind. The same one that had followed her up the mountain from the lawyer's office 11 days earlier. I didn't leave you the cabin, child. I left you the water. Read every line. That night, restless, she built the fire smaller than usual, more out of habit than need. She sat close to the hearth, knees pulled up, thinking about paper and water, thinking about a woman who checked her own survey lines 3 times over 40 years, long before she ever needed to. Her hand found the loose stone again without her meaning it to. She'd swept past it a dozen times that week, made a mental note twice to mortar it back in properly before winter, forgotten both times. Now her fingers worked at the edge of it, almost on their own, feeling how it gave differently than stone should give, feeling how the gap behind it breathed a thread of cooler air against her knuckles. She got the trowel from beside the door. She worked the stone loose in the firelight, her heart going faster than the task should have called for. When it finally came free in her hands, dust and 40 years of spider silk sifting down onto her wrists, she found herself looking into a cavity no bigger than a shoebox, cut clean into the stone behind the hearth. Sitting inside it, dull with rust but unmistakably deliberate, was a metal tin. She did not open it that night. She sat holding it in her lap a long time, feeling its weight, listening to the fire settle. She thought, for the first time since the will reading, that maybe her grandmother's last joke hadn't been on her after all. She waited until morning, when the light was honest and her hands had stopped shaking enough to be useful. The tin's lid had rusted at the seam. She worked a butter knife around the edge for the better part of 10 minutes before it finally gave with a small tearing sound, like something exhaling after a long-held breath. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth gone stiff with age, was a brass key, small, old-fashioned, the kind that belonged to a lockbox rather than a door. Beneath it, folded twice and sealed against the damp inside a second layer of waxed paper, sat a manila envelope. On the front of it, in the same careful hand that had written 100 porch step sayings into Nora's childhood, were 4 words. For Nora, read everything. Nora sat on the cabin floor with the tin in her lap and the envelope in her hands a long time before she opened it. Some part of her understood whatever was inside would change the shape of the next several weeks of her life. She wanted 1 more minute of not knowing, the way you sometimes want 1 more minute of a good dream before the alarm gets you. When she finally opened it, she found 3 things. A single sheet of yellowed paper, covered in Opal's handwriting, dated 11 years back. A photocopy of a deed, stamped and recorded, dated 1986. A courthouse seal, pressed faint but legible into the corner. And a smaller note, just a few lines, tucked behind the others like it wanted to be found last. She read Opal's letter first, sitting cross-legged on the floor, in a patch of morning sun. My Nora, it began. If you are reading this, I am gone. Garrett has already told you the cabin is worthless, and you already believe him a little, because that is what that family does. They tell you a thing enough times, and you start hearing it in your own voice. I need you to stop hearing it in his voice and start hearing it in mine. I did not leave you the cabin because it was all I had left to give. I left you the cabin because it is the only piece of this whole estate I ever actually controlled outright, free and clear. A deed I wrote myself and had recorded myself. Never once let a lawyer touch it. Lawyers work for whoever's paying them, and I was not always sure who that would be by the time I was gone. In 1986, I had Hollis Pruitt survey this parcel. I recorded a deed that ties Polly's Spring and the road access above the old fence line to this cabin. Only to this cabin. Not to the 60 acres below. Not to the house on Persimmon Street. To this acre and a quarter, and whoever holds it. I did this because your uncle has never once in his life valued a thing until someone else wanted to take it from him. I knew that someday he would sell that land to someone bigger than himself. Someone who would need water and a road more than they'd ever need his good opinion of himself. On that day, whoever holds this cabin holds every card at that table, whether anyone else in the family understands that or not. I am leaving that person to be you, Nora, because you are the only one who ever drove up this mountain to sit with an old woman. She had nothing left to offer you but stories and bad coffee, and you never once asked what was in it for you. Read every line of the enclosed deed. Have Hollis explain any of it you don't follow. He still remembers every line of it better than I do these days. And when the day comes that someone tries to buy you out cheap because they think you're desperate, remember this. I didn't leave you the cabin, child. I left you the water. That was always the whole inheritance. The cabin was just where I hid the paper. I love you. I always did. Out loud where the others could hear it and chose not to listen. Opal. Nora read it twice, then a third time. By the third time, her hands weren't shaking from grief anymore. They were shaking from something closer to adrenaline, the particular electricity of understanding that the ground under your feet is not the ground you thought it was. She spread the photocopied deed out on the cabin floor next to the letter. She tried to make sense of the legal language. Most of it swam past her the way legal language always had, dense with whereas and appurtenant, and heretofore. But a few phrases stood out even to her untrained eye, together with all rights of way, easements, and water rights, appurtenant to Polly's Spring, the road as it now exists across the Servient estate, senior and superior to any subsequently recorded interest. She didn't fully understand it, but she understood enough to know it mattered, and she understood exactly who she needed to call. Hollis Pruitt arrived that Saturday with a cardboard box of old survey plats balanced on one hip, his reading glasses already pushed up on his forehead. Nora handed him the photocopied deed without a word. He read it standing in the cabin doorway, the morning light behind him. His face went through 3 or 4 expressions before it settled on something Nora hadn't seen on anyone since the funeral. Something like relief. "Well, I'll be," he said quietly. "You knew about this. I knew we recorded a deed. I ran the survey. I witnessed her signature. I filed the paperwork down at the courthouse myself. She didn't trust the mail with it." He tapped the page, right at the clause about senior and superior interest. "I did not know she'd written it this tight. This isn't just an easement, Nora. This is a dominant estate clause. It means whoever owns this cabin has a legally recorded senior right to that spring water and that road. Predates anything sold or signed after 1986 by 4 decades. Anybody buying land below this cabin that depends on that spring or that road has to deal with whoever's holding this deed. No way around it. Not legally. And the 60 acres my uncle sold runs right along Bee Tree Road below here, takes its water straight off Polly's Spring, same as this cabin always has." Hollis looked up at her. For the first time since he'd shown up at the bottom of her driveway, his voice had an edge of something fierce in it. Something protective. Something that had clearly been waiting a long time to be said out loud. "Your grandmother made me write it twice, so no lawyer could pretend not to see it. She told me that in 1986, standing right about where you're standing now. I always wondered what she meant by it. I understand it now. What do I do?" "Nothing yet," Hollis said. He folded the copy carefully and handed it back to her, like it was made of glass. "You get the original recorded deed pulled from the county register. You make certified copies. You do not say one word to your uncle, or his boys, or anybody from that development company. You're standing somewhere they can't laugh at you and walk away. Your grandmother waited 40 years to play this card. You can wait a few more weeks and play it right." He left a box of plats with her, old brittle paper marked in his own younger hand. He left her something else too, standing at the bottom of the steps before he climbed back into his truck. "She used to sit right here," he said, nodding at the porch. "And tell me the water always finds where it's supposed to go, no matter how many rocks somebody piles in front of it. I thought she was talking about the spring." He shook his head, almost smiling. "She was talking about you the whole time, I expect." Nora stood on the porch a long while after his truck disappeared down Bee Tree Road, holding the letter, holding the deed, feeling for the first time in 3 weeks like the ground beneath the cabin was not borrowed, but hers. Entirely and legally hers. In a way none of them upstairs in that law office had bothered to check. Down the mountain, in an office park 40 minutes away, a man named Roy Fenner sat behind a desk with the Century Ridge Development logo on the wall behind him. He reviewed a closing timeline that named September as the target date for a resort project valued, on paper, at $4.4 million, contingent on 60 acres of timber and pasture. His own engineers had already confirmed it depended entirely on one small, reliable spring and one narrow access road, both of which, according to a courthouse record, nobody on his team had thought to pull, belonged to somebody else. He didn't know her name yet. He would soon enough. Nora went back to work at the Sorrel Cafe the following Monday, like nothing in her life had changed at all. Hollis had told her to wait. $41 had a way of teaching a person patience, whether they wanted the lesson or not. She poured coffee. She carried plates. She let Patsy Duncan slide her an extra biscuit some mornings, without either of them commenting on it. She said nothing to anyone. Not about a deed from 1986. Not about a spring. Not about a brass key that now lived on a shoelace around her neck, tucked under her shirt where nobody could see it. She went to the county register of deeds on her one day off. She stood in line behind a farmer, arguing about a fence line. When it was her turn, she asked the clerk, a heavy-set woman named Deb Sizemore, who'd gone to high school with Nora's mother, to pull the original recorded deed from 1986. Book and page number, copied off Hollis's photocopy, in her own careful hand. Deb came back 20 minutes later with a thick leather-bound volume older than either of them. She turned it to a page where Opal Vance's signature sat next to Hollis Pruitt's. Witnessed and notarized. The county seal pressed dark and official into the corner, exactly as it had been for 40 years. Waiting. You want a certified copy? Deb asked. 3, Nora said. Please. Deb looked at her a beat longer than the request called for. This about that resort thing everybody's talking about. The one going in below Sorrel Mountain. I don't know anything about a resort, Nora said. True enough, 3 weeks earlier. It felt like a small lie now, sitting in her mouth. Well? Deb slid the certified copies across the counter, official stamps still warm from the machine. Your grandmother came in here in 1986, made me double-check every line of this before she'd signed the recording fee. I was 22 years old, thought she was the most particular woman I'd ever met. She smiled a little sad around the edges. Turns out she just knew something the rest of us didn't. Nora carried the 3 certified copies home in a manila folder she'd bought special for the purpose. She kept them in the coffee can on the windowsill, right next to the folded $20 bill from a stranger and the scrap of notebook paper that had come with it. It felt right somehow, keeping the 2 kindnesses close together. The second envelope came 3 days later, not left in the door this time, mailed with a Charlotte postmark, a return address for a law firm Nora had never heard of. Inside was a letter from Roy Fenner himself, on Century Ridge Development letterhead, polite in the particular way that only gets used by people who are worried. Dear Miss Vance, it began, we understand you have recently taken possession of a small parcel adjacent to property currently under contract with our firm. As a gesture of goodwill and neighbourly courtesy, we would like to extend an offer to purchase your parcel outright for the sum of $9,000, well above typical market value for a structure of this size and condition, allowing you to move forward without the burden of costly repairs or upkeep. $9,000. 3 weeks earlier, that would have felt like the sky opening up. Now Nora sat on the porch step, the letter in her lap, the spring running below her, Hollis's voice in her head. Your grandmother waited 40 years to play this card. You can wait a few more weeks and play it right. She did not respond to the letter. Not that week. Garrett found out about the offer before Nora did anything at all with it. Garrett had a way of finding out things, usually through Denny Ash, who had a way of talking when he should have been keeping his mouth shut, especially after his second bourbon at the Elks Lodge on a Friday night. $9,000. Garrett stood in Nora's weed-choked driveway 2 days later, arms crossed, sweat already soaking through his collar, though it wasn't even 10 in the morning. Tyler leaned against the truck behind him, arms crossed the same way, like father and son had rehearsed the pose. For that shack. You believe that? I heard, Nora said. She stood on her own porch, not coming down the steps to meet him. She noticed it made him raise his voice slightly to be heard. She found she did not mind that at all. You ought to take it, Garrett said. $9,000 is more than that place has been worth in 50 years. More than it's worth now if we're being honest, which I always try to be. You've never once been honest with me in your life, Uncle Garrett. The words came out flatter and calmer than she expected. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or the first thin edge of worry. He covered it fast with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes this time. Take the money, Nora. $9,000 is a fresh start. You take that, you get yourself an apartment somewhere with actual plumbing. You put this whole sad little chapter behind you. He gestured at the cabin, like it was something distasteful he'd stepped in. Nobody's going to blame you for walking away from a place like this. Funny, Nora said. Nobody seemed to think it was worth anything at all 6 weeks ago. Now a company's offering $9,000 for it. And you drove all the way up here on a Tuesday morning to make sure I take it fast. Tyler shifted against the truck. Garrett's jaw worked once, twice before he answered. It's a good offer, he said. Quieter now. Then why does it feel like you're the one who needs me to say yes? Nobody answered that. Garrett looked at her a long moment. The mountain quiet around them, except for birdsong and the distant murmur of the spring. Then he turned and got back in the truck without another word. Tyler climbed in after him. Nora watched them pull away down Bee Tree Road, gravel popping under the tyres. She thought, not for the first time, about how much a person's silence could say once they finally ran out of things worth laughing at. That night she called Hollis, told him about the letter, about Garrett's visit, about the sweat on his collar at 10 in the morning. They're scared, Hollis said. She could hear him smiling through the phone line. $9,000 is nothing to a $4.4 million deal. If they're offering you $9,000, it means somebody on their side has already told them what happens if they don't. What do I do? You wait a little longer, and you let me make one phone call first, Hollis said. There's a young fellow works for the state, does title research on the side. Used to be one of my crew back when I still had a crew. I want him looking at every parcel Century Ridge has bought or optioned around that spring. Quiet like. Before you show your hand, you want to know exactly how much rope they've already used hanging themselves before you pull it tight. It took Hollis's contact 11 days to put together what he called a chain of title map, a hand-drawn sketch of every parcel along Bee Tree Road, and who held what interest in each one. Hollis spread it across Nora's kitchen table, tracing the lines with one crooked finger. The picture it made took Nora's breath clean out of her chest. Century Ridge hadn't just bought her uncle's 60 acres. They'd spent the better part of 18 months quietly optioning 4 other parcels along the ridge, borrowing against future resort revenue to do it, structuring the whole $4.4 million project around a single assumption that water and road access from the upper mountain would simply come with the land, the way it usually did, the way nobody bothered questioning until somebody finally did. They built a $4 million building on a foundation nobody poured, Hollis said, and your grandmother poured the only foundation that actually exists, 40 years before they ever thought to build anything at all. 2 days before he brought the map to her kitchen table, Hollis had asked her to come by his place instead, a low brick house on the edge of town, a detached garage he still called the shop. He'd retired from surveying work 6 years earlier. Inside, the garage smelled like machine oil and old paper. Against one wall stood a bank of steel filing cabinets, each drawer labelled in his own neat surveyor's hand. Decades of parcels and plats, organised by year, going back to the 70s. Your grandmother's file. Hollis pulled open a drawer marked 1985 through 1988. He thumbed through hanging folders until he found one labelled simply Vance, Sorrel Mountain. I kept copies of everything I ever surveyed. Habit from the early days, when courthouses sometimes lost things, and a man's own records were the only proof he'd done the work at all. He spread the contents across a long workbench, scarred with 40 years of cut lines and pencil marks. The original field notes in his own handwriting, cramped and precise. Distances and bearings, recorded in a private shorthand, only he could fully read anymore. A carbon copy of the deed language before it went to the courthouse for typing. And a single photograph, black and white, curling slightly at the corners. A younger Hollis Pruitt standing beside a younger Opal Vance at the spring itself, both of them squinting into the sun. Opal's hand resting on a survey stake, driven into the ground exactly where the water first broke the surface of the mountain. That's the day we set the boundary marker, Hollis said, tapping the photograph. October of 1986. She insisted on being there for it, even though most landowners never bother. Said she wanted to see with her own eyes exactly where the line got drawn. Since a line on paper only means something if somebody's willing to stand where it actually falls. Nora picked up the photograph. She studied her grandmother's face, 30 years younger than the one she remembered, already carrying the same steady, unreadable calm Nora had spent her whole childhood trying to read and rarely succeeding. She looked nervous to you? Hollis asked. No, Nora said. She looks like she already knew how this was going to go. That's exactly how she looked, Hollis said. I remember thinking it was strange at the time. Most people are anxious signing a deed, worried they'll get robbed on the price, or the lines will be wrong. Opal signed hers like she was closing a door on something a long time coming, locking it careful behind her. He gathered the field notes back into their folder. Gentle with them, the way you're gentle with something irreplaceable. I want you to have these. The original notes, the carbon, the photograph. They corroborate the courthouse copy. If anybody ever tries to claim the recorded deed's been altered or misfiled, developers with $4 million on the line have been known to try that, in my experience. You think Century Ridge would go that far? I think men who've already spent money against a deal they don't legally have will consider things, Hollis said. Things they'd never consider on an honest day. Better you walk into that room with more proof than you need than not quite enough. Nora took the folder home that evening. She added it to the coffee can's growing collection, though it no longer fit inside the can itself. She'd since moved everything into a proper accordion file Patsy had given her from a drawer at the diner. Patsy had said only that a woman about to go up against a $4 million company deserved better. Better than a rusted coffee can to hold her whole case in. She sat with the photograph a long while that night by the fire. Opal's steady, 30 years younger face, looking back at her across 4 decades. She understood, in a way she hadn't quite let herself understand before, that her grandmother hadn't simply gotten lucky with a deed clause that happened to matter later. She had built this, deliberately, patiently. The way a person builds anything meant to outlast them, one careful decision at a time, for 40 years. On the chance that someday, long after she was gone, a girl who kept showing up would need exactly this kind of protection, and would have the sense to look for it. Before he left that evening, Hollis paused at the door and looked back at the hearth. "You ever check behind the second stone?" he asked. "Left of the one you already found." Nora didn't understand at first. She'd assumed the loose stone was the only one. She got the flashlight and knelt again at the cold hearth. Hollis knelt down beside her, slower than she was, his knees complaining about it the whole way down. Her fingers found the mortar seam this time instead of just the stone. Somebody had packed it soft on purpose, decades back. Easy to work loose if you knew to look, and impossible to notice if you didn't. The second stone came free easier than the first had. Behind it sat a smaller tin, half the size of the one with the deed, rusted the same dull orange. Nora's hands were shaking a little by the time she got the lid worked loose. Inside was a bank passbook, the old paper kind, People's Trust of Caudle's Gap, stamped on the cover in faded gold. And folded beneath it, a savings certificate dated 1994, made out in Nora's own name. Nora Elaine Vance, written before Nora had turned 6 years old. "Lord have mercy," Hollis said quietly, and it was the first time all evening his voice had lost its steadiness. He turned the passbook toward the firelight and read the balance out loud, careful, like he didn't quite trust his own eyes. $6,140. Opened the year you started kindergarten. He looked at Nora. She was already building for you before your uncle's boys were out of diapers. "Why would she never tell me?" Nora asked. Her voice barely held. "Because telling you would have meant somebody else finding out too," Hollis said. "Your grandmother didn't build vaults so people could admire them, Nora. She built them so they'd still be standing after everybody who might have robbed them got tired of looking." He closed the passbook gently and set it back in her hands. $6,000 won't save that spring. But it tells you something the deed can't. She wasn't just protecting land, she was protecting you. Same money, same year, same handwriting. All of it aimed at a day she knew was coming, even if she never lived to see it arrive. Nora sat with that a long time after Hollis left, looking down at the hand-drawn map, at Polly's Spring marked in blue ink, right where the old surveyor had first found it in 1986. She thought about her grandmother sitting on this same porch, 40 years younger, pointing her cane at a spring nobody else thought mattered, seeing a day that hadn't come yet, with a clarity none of the rest of the family had ever managed to summon for anything at all. She folded the map carefully. She put it in the coffee can with everything else that had come to matter more than money ever had. Then she sat on the porch, as the light went gold and then grey over Sorrel Mountain, and she waited. The way her grandmother had taught her, without ever once saying the word patience out loud, for the day the family would finally be ready to hear what she had to say. It came sooner than she expected, and louder than she'd hoped. The second letter from Sentry Ridge arrived by certified mail. Nora had to sign for it at the post office window in town. The number inside had climbed from $9,000 to $22,000. A new paragraph, in tighter, more anxious language than the first letter had used. It referenced a survey discrepancy the company's engineers had recently identified. It expressed hope the matter could be resolved amicably, before it became necessary to involve additional parties. Additional parties, Hollis said when she read it to him over the phone, meant lawyers. Lawyers meant Sentry Ridge finally understood exactly how much trouble 1 acre and a quarter could cause a $4.4 million development. They were racing the clock now, instead of her. They've got a closing date, Hollis said. That letter you saw in Ash's office. Remember September. That's their deadline, not yours. They financed against that date. Every week that slips past, it cost them real money. Penalty clauses, interest, investors asking questions. You don't owe them a single hour of your patience. Garrett came back a third time. Alone this time. No Tyler leaning against the truck. That told Nora something had shifted before he even got out of the cab. He didn't come up onto the porch. He stood at the bottom of the steps, hat in his hands. An old habit she hadn't seen out of him since she was a little girl. Back when he still occasionally acted like a man who'd been raised right. $22,000, he said. That's real money, Nora. That's a down payment on an apartment. A car that runs. A whole different life than the one you're living up here. You didn't come up here for my sake, Uncle Garrett. He was quiet a moment, working his jaw the way he did when a truth was trying to get past something stubborn in him. Sentry Ridge is threatening to pull out of the whole deal, he finally said. Says there's a cloud on title. Something to do with water rights. Something from way back. Says if it's not settled by August, they walk. And I've already spent money against that sale, Nora. Real money. Tyler's got a truck payment tied up in it. I've got... He stopped himself. For the first time in Nora's whole life, she watched her Uncle Garrett Vance look like a man standing on ground that had started very quietly to give way beneath him. You spent money you didn't have yet, Nora said. Not unkindly, just stating the shape of it out loud, the way Opal always used to. That's not the point. It's exactly the point. He looked up at her on the porch. Something old and tired passed over his face. Something that might have been the ghost of an apology, if he'd had the words for one. Your grandmother did something, didn't she? Something with this land. Ash won't say straight out, but I can hear it in how careful he's gotten talking about it. Nora didn't answer that. She'd promised Hollis she'd play the card in a room where nobody could laugh and walk away. Garrett's driveway, hat in hands or not, wasn't that room. $22,000, Nora, he said again, quieter, almost pleading now, a register she had genuinely never once heard from him. Take it, before this whole thing collapses and there's nothing left for anybody. I'll think about it, she said, the truest lie she'd told anyone in 6 weeks. She watched him drive away, not quite believing her, which was fair, because she didn't believe herself either. 2 days after Garrett's driveway visit, Nora's mother called. She asked, in the careful, hopeful voice of a woman trying to broker a peace nobody had asked her to broker, whether Nora would come to Sunday dinner at Garrett's house, for the family's sake, before things got any more strained than they already were. Nora almost said no. She said yes instead. Hollis had told her once that the best place to learn what somebody was afraid of was a room. A room where they thought they still had the upper hand. Some small, curious part of her wanted to watch Garrett's kitchen table up close. Before she ever sat across from him again in a lawyer's office, the dinner was pot roast and the same green bean casserole Opal used to make, which Nora suspected was not an accident. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation stayed carefully, deliberately shallow. The weather, a cousin's new baby, whether the Baptist church was finally going to fix its parking lot. Garrett sat at the head of the table, looking, Nora thought, like a man holding his breath through an entire meal. How's the cabin treating you? Tyler finally asked. Too casual, reaching for the rolls without quite meeting her eyes. Fine, Nora said. Roof's mostly patched. Got the hearth cleaned out finally. You wouldn't believe what 40 years of ash looks like once you finally dig down to the bottom of it. She watched Garrett's fork pause, just slightly, halfway to his mouth. Ash, he repeated. Ash, dust, spiderwebs. Found an old stone back there that wasn't set quite right, if you can believe it. Grandma's mason must have had an off day. She kept her voice light and curious, exactly the voice of a granddaughter making small talk about home repairs. She watched 3 faces around that table go very carefully still. The particular stillness of people trying hard not to react to something they didn't yet understand the shape of. "You didn't find anything back there," Brett said. It came out less like a question than he probably meant it to. "Just ash," Nora said. She reached for the green beans. She let the silence stretch a beat longer than comfortable before adding, "Mild as anything." "Why were you expecting me to?" "No," Garrett said too quickly. "Course not," Tyler said, half a second behind him. The 2 answers landed on top of each other, in a way that told Nora more than either of them intended to tell her. "Grandma always did like her secrets," Nora said. She watched Garrett's hand tighten slightly around his fork. "Used to tell me when I was little that the quietest people usually knew the most. I never really understood what she meant by that." She smiled, easy, unthreatening. Probably nothing to it. She said a lot of things that didn't mean anything. Near the end, nobody at that table believed her. She could tell. Nobody at that table said another word about the cabin for the rest of the meal. That told her everything Hollis had wanted her to learn before she ever sat down. Somebody in that family already suspected there was more behind that hearth than $1 worth of nothing. And the suspicion alone had them rattled enough to trip over each other's denials at a dinner table over pot roast. She thanked her mother for the meal on the way out, hugged her, did not hug Garrett. She drove back up Beatree Road that night with the certainty, finally, that whatever came next, she wasn't walking into that conference room blind. And neither, in their own frightened way, were they. The 3rd letter didn't come from Sentry Ridge at all. It came from Denny Ash, on his own letterhead this time instead of the estate's, requesting Nora's presence at a meeting the following Thursday, at the same law office where she'd been handed a $1 deed 6 weeks earlier. To discuss, the letter said, in language so careful it practically apologised for existing, an amicable resolution to certain title, matters affecting the pending Sentry Ridge transaction. Hollis drove up to the cabin the evening before. He brought the certified deed copies, the hand-drawn chain of title map, and something else besides. A folder Nora hadn't seen before. Thin. Official-looking. The state seal on the cover. "Got my old surveying licence reinstated last month," he said, setting it on her kitchen table like it was nothing at all. His eyes gave away how much it wasn't. Figured if anybody was going to stand up in that room and confirm this deed says what it says, better it come from somebody current, somebody with 40 years of history on this exact parcel, not just an old man's memory. You didn't have to do that. Opal made me write that deed twice, so no lawyer could pretend not to see it, Hollis said. "I've been carrying that sentence around for 40 years, Nora, waiting to see what it was actually for. I'm not about to sit this part out now that I finally know." They went over it together that night at the kitchen table. The letter, the deed, the map, until Nora could recite the key clause from memory, senior and superior to any subsequently recorded interest, until she understood not just that she held the winning card, exactly why it was winning, which mattered more to her than the money ever had. She thought about Opal's letter, folded now soft at its creases from being read so many times. "I didn't leave you the cabin, child. I left you the water." That was always the whole inheritance. It was Hollis, folding up the hand-drawn map for the night, who brought up the second thing, almost as an afterthought. The way important things sometimes arrive dressed as nothing at all. "There's something else been bothering me," he said. "Your grandmother paid the recording fee out of her own purse in 1986. Cash. I remember because it surprised me at the time. Opal never carried more than a few dollars on her most days. Everybody in this county knew that. She ran that house tight as a fiddle string her whole life. But that day she peeled off $200 like it was nothing. Never once mentioned where it came from." Nora frowned. Grandpa's insurance money, maybe. He'd only been gone a year or 2 by then. I always figured the same. Except, Hollis hesitated. The particular hesitation of a man deciding whether an old loyalty still applied to a woman 6 weeks in the ground. "I ran into Deb Sizemore's mother at the co-op a while back, before she passed. She used to work the register at the old feed store your grandmother's family ran, back before it closed in the 70s. Said Opal's own daddy left everything to her older brother, same as families did back then, and Opal got nothing. Not $1. Walked away from that store with just her name and a hope chest. Deb's mother always wondered how a woman with nothing built the house on Persimmon Street free and clear inside of 15 years. Nora sat very still. What are you saying? I'm saying your grandmother knew exactly what it felt like to be handed nothing, Hollis said. Handed nothing by people who were supposed to love her enough to do better. I always thought this deed was about protecting you from Garrett. I'm starting to think it was about something older than that. I think Opal spent her whole life quietly making sure nobody in this family would ever again get to decide who deserved something. Who deserved something and who didn't. She just never told anybody she was doing it. That was always her way. Nora thought about the porch step sayings, the 100 small riddles Opal had planted over the years, like seeds in a garden she wouldn't live to see bloom. She understood for the first time that the deed wasn't the whole of what her grandmother had left her. It was the proof of a promise Opal had been keeping to herself since long before Nora was even born. A promise that the next Vance woman handed nothing would not this time walk away with nothing. She slept badly that night. Not from fear exactly. From the particular restlessness of standing at the edge of something about to change. The way the air changes before a storm crosses the ridge. Heavy. Waiting. She lay on the cot under her great-great-grandmother's quilt and thought about a woman 2 generations back who'd been cut out of a feed store. A woman 1 generation back who'd quietly spent 40 years making sure it never happened again. And a girl now lying awake on a mountain, about to become, whether she felt ready for it or not, the reason all of that patience had finally paid out. In the days that followed, the letters from Century Ridge stopped coming. That worried Hollis more than another offer would have. Silence means they're regrouping, he told her over the phone. Means their lawyers are trying to find a hole in the deed before they have to admit there isn't one. Don't mistake quiet for surrender. He was right. The quiet lasted 12 days. It ended with the letter from Denny Ash requesting her presence at the law office, the one that finally set a date. In those 12 days, Nora kept working the breakfast shift at the Sorrel Cafe, kept patching the roof 1 stone at a time, kept the coffee can on the windowsill filled now. Not just with a stranger's $20 and a scrap of grateful handwriting. Now with certified copies of a deed too. A deed about to upend a $4.4 million deal, built on land nobody had bothered to actually check. Patsy Duncan noticed the change in her first, the way people who watch other people for a living sometimes do. You're standing different, Patsy said one morning, refilling the sugar caddies while Nora wiped down the counter. Like somebody finally told you that you were allowed to. Something like that, Nora said. She didn't explain further. Hollis had told her to hold the card close until the room couldn't laugh and walk away. And Patsy, bless her, didn't push. 3 days before the meeting, Garrett showed up at the Sorrel Cafe instead of the cabin. That surprised Nora more than anything else he'd done in 6 weeks. Garrett Vance had never once in his life eaten breakfast anywhere his wife wasn't watching him order. He sat at the counter, not a booth, close enough that Nora couldn't avoid him without making a scene in front of Patsy and the 6 other regulars nursing coffee at that hour. I talked to a lawyer of my own, he said, low, not looking at her. Stirring sugar into coffee he hadn't asked her to pour. Fella out of Asheville, told him everything. About the deed, about the offer, about the loan. And, he said, if the deed's real, and it's recorded the way Hollis says it's recorded, there's nothing anybody can do about it. Not me. Not Asher. Not Century Ridge's whole legal department. Garrett's hand wasn't quite steady around the coffee cup. Said I ought to have had my own lawyer check title before I signed anything with that development company. Said that's business 101. Said I ought to have known better at 58 years old. You should have, Nora said. Not cruelly. Just true. The way Opal used to say true things. I know it. He finally looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen there since she was a little girl, back before he'd hardened into whatever he'd become somewhere in his 40s. I'm going to lose the equipment. Tyler's truck is already collateral on the loan I drew against that sale. Brett's been living in my basement because he lost his job in the spring, and I told him not to worry. I had a payout coming. He set the coffee cup down harder than he meant to. It rattled the saucer. I laughed at you, Nora. 6 weeks ago in that room, I laughed at a dollar deed like it was the funniest thing I'd heard all year. You did. Your grandmother left you something you had to earn twice over, didn't she? Once by loving her enough to keep showing up. Once by having the nerve to actually read what she gave you. He shook his head slowly. I never read anything of hers close enough to matter. Not once. Not the whole time she was alive. Nora didn't have an answer for that. Not one that would have felt honest coming out of her mouth. Not in front of Patsy and 6 regulars, and a stack of dirty coffee cups waiting on her. So she refilled his coffee without being asked, the way Opal used to do for people who didn't deserve kindness but needed it anyway. She let the silence sit between them until he paid his tab and left. She told Hollis about it that evening, sitting on the porch with Polly's Spring running below them in the fading light. Don't let it soften you before Thursday, Hollis said. A man can be sorry and still be the same man who laughed at you 6 weeks ago. Sorry doesn't undo the sale he already made, or the loan he already drew, or the 6 weeks he spent trying to buy you out cheap before he ever once said your name with any respect in it. You can forgive him plenty, someday, on your own time. Don't let it cost you the room on Thursday. Nora thought about that a long while after he left, about the shape forgiveness might eventually take, whether it had to arrive on anyone's schedule but her own. She decided, watching the light go down gold and then grey over Sorrel Mountain, that Hollis was right. There would be time enough later to decide what kind of niece she wanted to be. Time enough to decide what she owed a man who'd only ever learned to see her the day the money made him. Word had gotten around town by then, the way word always did in a place with one stoplight and one diner. Deb Sizemore hadn't said anything directly, certified copies of deeds being confidential business even in a small county. But 3 certified copies pulled in one visit was the kind of thing that got mentioned at the co-op. From the co-op, it travelled to the Elks Lodge. From the Elks Lodge, it reached, eventually, nearly everyone in Caudle's Gap who cared to listen. Patsy Duncan heard a version of it from her sister-in-law, who'd heard it from a cousin who worked at the courthouse. She brought it to Nora directly, the way Patsy handled most things. Straight on, without apology. Folks are saying Opal Vance outsmarted her whole family from the grave, Patsy said, wiping down the counter at closing time. The diner empty except for the 2 of them and the hum of the refrigerator case, saying she built something into that cabin deed 40 years back that's about to sink a $4 million deal. She looked up at Nora, something warm and a little fierce in her face. That true? Some version of it, Nora said. Good, Patsy said, a finality that ended the conversation and started something else entirely. A kind of quiet, town-wide rooting for that Nora hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with. Your grandmother tipped $1 on a $2 check for 40 years, just so the girls here would remember her kindly. Woman like that deserves to win one, even if she's not here to see it. That night, alone in the cabin, Nora sat by the hearth with the loose stone set carefully back in its place. The cavity behind it, empty now. Everything it had held either on her body or in the coffee can on the windowsill. She thought about how strange it was, that a woman's whole quiet 40-year war could be won so fast. Won by a girl who'd only understood the stakes of it for 6 weeks. She thought about Opal's letter, about a woman cut out of a feed store by her own father and brother, spending the rest of her life making sure the pattern broke somewhere, even if it broke a full generation after she was gone. She thought about the brass key still on its shoelace around her neck. A key to nothing anymore. Its lockbox long since found and opened. Kept now the way you keep a thing that did its job. She slept better than she expected to, that last night before the meeting. The mountain quiet around her, the spring running steady below the cabin, exactly as it had run for longer than anyone in her family had been alive. Indifferent to who owned the paper. Patient the way water is always patient. Certain that eventually it finds where it's supposed to go. The morning of the meeting arrived grey and close, the kind of low mountain sky that made the whole valley feel like it was holding its breath along with her. Hollis called before 8, his voice steadier than hers felt. You've got everything. The certified copies. The letter. The map. She looked at the folder on her kitchen table, thin as it was, holding inside it the entire weight of 40 years. The whole thing fits in one folder, Hollis. Doesn't seem like it should. Truth usually does fit in one folder, he said. It's the lies that need 6 of them to hold together. I'll meet you in the parking lot. Wouldn't miss walking in there beside you for anything this county could offer me. He was waiting when she pulled in, leaning against his truck in a collared shirt she suspected he'd bought special for the occasion, his old reinstated surveyor's license tucked into a folder of his own, under one arm. He didn't say anything as she got out of the Corolla He just fell into step beside her. The two of them crossed the parking lot together, toward the same building. 6 weeks earlier, a room full of people in there had decided $1 was exactly what Nora Vance was worth. "You nervous?" he asked, at the door. "Some." "Good," Hollis said. "Means you understand what's about to happen in there." "Your grandmother was nervous the day she recorded this deed too. Told me so herself. Doing the right thing rarely feels calm while you're doing it. It just feels calm afterward. Looking back." He held the door for her. "After you." She climbed the same stairs she'd climbed 6 weeks before, $41 poorer in spirit that day than she was now, though her checking account hadn't grown by much in the meantime. The receptionist, a young woman Nora didn't recognise, looked up and directed them down the same hallway, past the same framed diplomas, toward the same conference room. The same portrait of somebody's dead partner had watched the whole first act of this story unfold without comment. Nora paused outside the door for one breath, her hand on the folder. She thought, unbidden, of the $20 bill still folded in the coffee can at home, the stranger's careful handwriting on a scrap of notebook paper. "Your grandmother fixed my truck's transmission for free in 1996 and never once mentioned it again. Welcome home." She thought of Patsy's dollar tip inheritance, 40 years of small, unremarked kindnesses that had somehow, without anyone planning it quite this way, built toward a single Thursday morning 6 weeks after a funeral. Then she opened the door. The conference room hadn't changed at all in 6 weeks. Same portrait of somebody's dead partner on the wall, same air conditioning fighting a losing war against July. Denny Ash sat at the head of the table again, glasses pushed up his nose before he'd said a single word. This time 3 new faces sat across from Nora, instead of just her family. A lawyer for Century Ridge, introduced as Mr. Calloway, a young associate taking notes, and Roy Fenner himself, grey-suited, tired around the eyes in the particular way of a man who'd spent the last 2 weeks on the phone with investors, asking questions he couldn't answer yet. Garrett sat where he'd sat before, Tyler and Brett flanking him, all 3 of them dressed a notch nicer than usual. The way people dress when they've decided a meeting matters more than they'd like to admit. "Thank you all for coming," Ash said, pressing his glasses up again. "We're here to discuss a title matter that has come to light regarding the Sorrel Mountain parcel, its potential impact on the pending Century Ridge transaction." "Cut to it, Denny," Garrett said. His voice had none of its usual thickness in it now, just a thin, tired edge. "We've all got somewhere to be." Roy Fenner leaned forward, folding his hands on the table, in a gesture that might have looked reasonable in any other room. "Ms. Vance, we understand there may be some historical encumbrance affecting the parcel, adjacent to our development. We'd like to resolve this quickly and fairly. We've already extended a generous offer for your property, and we're prepared to increase that offer substantially if it means moving forward without further delay." "How substantially?" Hollis asked, from the chair beside Nora, where he'd sat down without being invited, and nobody had found the nerve to object. Calloway, the lawyer, answered for Fenner. "We could go as high as $60,000 for the parcel, contingent on a full and immediate release of any claimed rights affecting the adjacent property." $60,000. 6 weeks earlier, Nora would have said yes before he finished the sentence. She heard Garrett exhale beside her, something almost like relief, like he thought the number alone might be enough to end it, enough to save whatever he'd already spent against a deal that hadn't closed yet. Nora set her folder on the table without opening it yet. "My grandmother told me something when I was a little girl," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, steady in the particular way Opal's own voice used to go, right before she said something nobody in the room wanted to hear. She said, "Read every line." I didn't understand what she meant for a long time. I understand it now. She opened the folder. She took out the certified copy of the 1986 deed, the one with the county seal pressed dark into the corner. She slid it across the table, the same way Denny Ash had once slid a $1 deed across to her, except this time she watched every face on the other side of the table as it landed. "This is a certified copy of a deed my grandmother, Opal Vance, recorded at the Caudle County Courthouse in 1986, Nora said. "It grants the cabin parcel on Sorrel Mountain a senior dominant right, a right to Polly's Spring, and to the access road across what is now my uncle's 60 acres. It predates any interest Century Ridge has purchased or optioned by close to 40 years. Calloway reached for the page first. He scanned it fast, his mouth moving slightly as he read. Nora watched the exact moment he hit the clause Hollis had underlined for her the week before, senior and superior to any subsequently recorded interest. His face didn't move much. His hand did. He set the page down slightly too fast, like it had gotten warm. "This is Hollis Pruitt," Nora said before anyone could speak. "He surveyed this parcel in 1986, on my grandmother's instruction, and again in 1991 and 1994. He witnessed her signature on this deed. He filed it himself at the courthouse. He's a licensed surveyor in the state of North Carolina, and he can confirm every line of this document because he wrote half of it." Hollis leaned forward. He folded his weathered hands on the table. The calm of a man who had waited 40 years for exactly this moment. He intended to enjoy every second of it, now that it had finally come. "Opal Vance made me write this deed twice," Hollis said, "so no lawyer could pretend not to see it. I'll say that again for the room, since I expect somebody's going to want it in writing. She made me write it twice. She recorded it herself. She paid the fee out of her own purse in 1986. She told me standing on that porch that a mountain spring belongs to whoever holds the paper, not whoever holds the prettiest house." He looked directly at Roy Fenner. "You've built a $4 million project on an assumption that water and road access would simply come along with land you bought. Land from a man who never actually held the rights to either. That assumption was wrong 40 years, before you ever drew up your first blueprint." The room went quiet in a way Nora would remember for the rest of her life. A specific, textured silence. The sound of several people doing math they badly did not want to be doing in front of witnesses. Garrett found his voice first, though it came out smaller than she'd ever heard it. "That can't be right. That land's been in this family for—" "The land has," Nora said. "The water rights and the road easement haven't. Not since 1986. Grandma made sure of that, 4 decades before any of us knew there'd be a reason to." "You knew about this," Garrett said, turning on her. Some of the old thickness tried to climb back into his voice and failed to find purchase. "This whole time, you sat up on that mountain knowing—" "I found it 11 days after you laughed at the will reading," Nora said. She did not raise her voice. She had learned a long time ago that voice raising had never once put money back into an account. She found, sitting in that room, that she didn't need to raise it now either. "Behind a loose stone in a hearth you told me wasn't worth the gas to drive up and see. Grandma left me a letter. She said she didn't leave me the cabin. She left me the water. And she told me to read every line, which is apparently something none of you ever bothered to do, with anything she ever handed you." Calloway cleared his throat, addressing Fenner in a low voice that carried anyway. "We need to pull this transaction and have our own title team review immediately. If this deed is what it appears to be, we cannot close in September. We may not be able to close at all without a negotiated resolution directly with Ms. Vance." "How much of the deal collapses?" Fenner asked him. Quiet, tired, already knowing the answer before it came. "All of it," Calloway said. "Without water and road access, that parcel has no development value. The whole project is contingent on those 60 acres, and those 60 acres are worthless without what this deed controls." Garrett's face had gone the colour of old ash. "My loan," he said, mostly to himself, though the whole room heard it. "I already drew against the closing. Tyler's truck, the equipment, That's between you and your bank, Garrett," Ash said quietly. For the first time in 6 weeks, Nora heard something almost like sympathy in the lawyer's voice, though it was hard to tell if it was for Garrett or simply for the tidy collapse of a deal he'd helped build on sand. Nora looked at her uncle across the table, at Tyler's stunned, still face, at Brett staring down at his own hands, like they might offer an explanation the room hadn't already given him. She thought about the keys hitting the carpet 6 weeks earlier, and nobody moving to pick them up but her. "I'm not trying to ruin anybody," Nora said. She meant it mostly. There was a corner of her that had waited 6 weeks to say the next part, and intended to say it anyway. "I'm not selling for $60,000 or $600,000. This was never about a number for me. It was about the fact that every single one of you decided I was worth exactly what you paid for me, which was nothing. And it turns out you were wrong about the land the same way you were wrong about me. Nobody in the room had an answer for that." Roy Fenner sat very still, staring at the deed like it might rearrange itself into something more forgiving if he looked long enough. Callaway was already texting someone, probably a partner, probably someone who managed a much larger and much more anxious set of investors than the room currently contained. "What do you want?" Fenner finally asked her. It was, Nora realised, the first honest question anyone from that side of the table had asked her in 6 weeks. "I want the deed recorded exactly as it stands," Nora said. "I want my grandmother's rights respected the way she built them to be respected, 40 years ahead of a day she never lived to see. And I want my uncle's 60 acres left alone by your company. That land was never actually yours to build on, not without going through me first. I'm not interested in doing business with anyone who thought a $1 joke at a funeral was a fair way to start." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Denny Ash eventually cleared his throat. He suggested, in the careful voice of a man trying to salvage some professional dignity, that perhaps everyone needed time to consult their own counsel. The room had none of that dignity left to spare. Nora stood. She gathered her folder. She did not shake her uncle's hand on the way out, same as 6 weeks before, though this time nobody in that room was laughing. The collapse, when it came the way Hollis had told her it would, not with a bang. With a slow, procedural unwinding that took the better part of 3 weeks and involved far more paperwork than drama. That suited Nora fine. She had never once wanted a scene, only a truth acknowledged out loud in a room that couldn't pretend not to hear it. Century Ridge's title team confirmed within 4 days what Callaway had already suspected in that conference room. The 1986 deed was valid, properly recorded, properly witnessed, and legally senior to every interest the company had purchased or optioned along Beetree Road. Roy Fenner sent one more letter. This one wasn't an offer. It was a formal notice that Century Ridge Development was withdrawing from its purchase agreement with Garrett Vance, citing an inability to secure necessary water and access rights for the proposed project. The 60 acres reverted, at least on paper, to Garrett, minus the money he'd already spent against a sale that no longer existed. The bank in Asheville that had financed his equipment loan against the anticipated closing called the note due within 30 days. When he couldn't cover it, they repossessed the excavator and the 2 dump trucks he'd used as collateral. The same equipment he'd been counting on to build whatever came next after the resort deal made him, in his own words to Ash, a man people finally had to respect. Tyler's truck went back to the dealership. Brett moved out of Garrett's basement into a rented room above the hardware store, working the counter there for $9 an hour. Nora heard about it the same way she heard everything now, through Patsy, through the co-op, through a town with one stoplight and a long memory. Tyler called her once in September. A short, awkward conversation. Neither of them seemed fully prepared for it. He didn't ask for anything. He said he'd been thinking about the smirk into his coffee at the will reading. He said he wasn't proud of it. He hoped someday, once some time had passed, they could talk like cousins again. Not like 2 people on opposite sides of a deed. Nora told him that was possible. Someday, just not today. He said he understood. That was the whole conversation. 4 sentences that cost neither of them anything. It still felt to Nora like the first honest exchange she'd had with anyone in that branch of the family in years. Brett never called at all, though Patsy mentioned once that he'd started coming into the diner on his lunch break from the hardware store. Quiet, polite, always leaving exact change, and never once mentioning Nora's name. She supposed that was its own small kind of apology, the kind some men only knew how to offer sideways. She did not gloat. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't want to. What she wanted, watching the whole thing unwind at its own patient pace, was simply for it to be over, for the mountain to go back to being a mountain instead of a battlefield, for the spring to run the way it had always run, indifferent and steady, underneath whatever the humans above it decided to fight about. Hollis came with her to the courthouse that day. He stood a respectful step behind her at the counter. Deb pulled the heavy leather-bound volume open to record the confirmation. Hollis leaned in close enough to read the entry as it went down. He traced the line with one finger, the same way he'd once traced the chain of title map at Nora's kitchen table. 40 years, he said, quiet, mostly to himself. I filed the original entry in this same book back when I still had dark hair. Bad knees felt like something that happened to other men. Never once expected to stand here again watching it get confirmed against a $4 million development that didn't exist yet when we wrote it. You did good work, Hollis, Nora told him. Your grandmother did the thinking, he said. I just held the chain and wrote down what she told me to write down. Man could do worse with a career than that, if you ask me. He straightened, watching Deb blot the ink dry. Some men spend their whole working life building things that fall down before they're 40 years old. I spent mine writing 4 sentences that outlasted a corporation's whole legal department. I'll take that trade. The county recorded a formal confirmation of the 1986 deeds priority 2 weeks after the meeting, a clerical formality. It took Deb Sizemore 11 minutes. Nora stood at the counter, watching the stamp come down, and felt something settle in her chest. Something that had been unsettled since the day the lawyer first said the word cabin like it was a punishment. Your grandmother would be awful proud, Deb said, sliding the recorded copy across the counter. Awful proud, and not even a little bit surprised. She always did play a long game, that woman. Garrett came to the cabin one more time, 3 weeks after the meeting. On foot this time, because the truck had gone back to the bank along with everything else. He stood at the bottom of the driveway the way he had the very first time Hollis had ever stood there. Hat in his hands, a man visibly smaller than the one who'd laughed at a $1 deed 2 months earlier. I'm not here to ask you for anything, he said before she could ask what he wanted. I know I don't have any right to. Nora came down off the porch this time. There was something in the shape of him standing there that didn't call for the same distance she kept the last 2 times. I lost the equipment, he said. Lost the truck. Tyler's back living with his mother. Brett's renting a room he can barely afford. He looked up the mountain past her, toward the spring, like he was seeing it for the first time in his life. Which, in a way, he was. I spent 30 years thinking your grandmother was simple because she never wanted more than that little house and her Sunday coffee at the diner. Never once considered she might be the smartest person in this whole family, quietly waiting on all of us to prove her right about exactly how much we deserved. She loved you, Uncle Garrett, Nora said. She meant it because it was true even now, even after everything. She told me once that loving somebody and trusting them with everything you have aren't the same thing. She was right not to confuse them where you were concerned. He nodded slowly, jaw working the way it always did before something honest tried to get out. I laughed at you in that room, dropped the keys and laughed like you were the punchline of a joke. I'd been telling my whole life. He met her eyes. For the first time she could remember, he didn't look away first. I'm sorry, Nora. Not because it cost me the deal, because it was cruel and I knew it was cruel while I was doing it. I did it anyway because it felt good in the moment to have somebody smaller than me in the room for once. Nora let that sit between them a while, the mountain quiet around them, the spring running steady below. I'm not going to pretend the last 6 weeks didn't happen, she finally said, and I'm not going to pretend I forgive all of it today, standing right here, but I'm not interested in watching you lose everything either. Not really. Not the way some part of me thought I might want to, back when you were laughing. She looked at him. This shrunken, sorry version of the man who'd once dropped house keys on a conference room table like a prize. There's a caretaker's cabin down by the spring access road, on my acre and a quarter. Falling down worse than this one was 6 weeks ago. If you want honest work fixing it up in exchange for a fair wage and nothing else, I could use the help. And you clearly could use the work. Garrett stared at her a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that looked almost like the boy he must have been once, before 30 years of deciding what other people's work was worth had hardened into whatever he'd become. You'd let me work for you, he said, not quite believing it. After everything. I'd let you earn something honest, Nora said. That's different than letting you off the hook. I want to be clear it's not the same thing as forgiveness, either. Not yet. But Grandma spent her whole life making sure the people who wronged her still got a fair shot at doing better, so long as they were willing to actually do the work of it. I figure I can manage the same. If you can manage showing up on time with a level head and no complaints about who's signing your check now. He took the offer. He showed up the following Monday at 7 in the morning with his own tools, the ones the bank hadn't been able to touch. He worked the caretaker's cabin roof for $9 an hour, under a niece he'd once handed a $1 deed as a joke. Neither of them mentioned the irony, out loud, though Nora suspected they were both thinking it most days. The town noticed the way the town noticed everything. Patsy Duncan started sending a second biscuit home with Nora most mornings. One for her. And, she said without being asked, one for that uncle of hers. A man doing honest work deserved a decent breakfast same as anybody. Whatever he'd done before he started doing better. Hollis came by most Saturdays that fall, sometimes with more old survey plats, sometimes with nothing but a thermos and the particular company of a man who'd waited 40 years to see a promise pay out. Wasn't quite ready to stop witnessing it in person. He and Nora fixed the porch together, squared the sagging shoulder of it, board by board. When they finished, he stood back and looked at it a long while. Opal used to sit right there, he said, pointing to the top step, and tell me the water always finds where it's supposed to go, no matter how many rocks somebody piles in front of it. Took me 2 months after she died to understand she wasn't talking about the spring at all. What was she talking about? You, Hollis said. She was talking about you the whole time, and I was too slow an old man to hear it until you proved her right. Roy Fenner came back one more time, in October. Without Calloway this time. Without the young associate taking notes. Just himself and a folder considerably thinner than the one he'd carried into the conference room in July. He asked to meet at the Sorrel Cafe instead of the law office. Nora took that, correctly, as a sign. He understood exactly how much ground had shifted since the last time either of them had sat across a table from the other. We've redesigned the project, he told her. Over coffee neither of them touched much. Smaller footprint. 12 units instead of the 40 we originally planned. Clustered lower on the ridge, away from your parcel entirely. We don't need the full water allocation anymore. We've rerouted the access road through a right-of-way we're purchasing separately from the county. One that doesn't cross your grandmother's easement at all. Then why are you here? Because even the scaled-down version still needs a modest, limited water allocation from Polly's Spring for the 12 units. And because our investors want the whole matter resolved cleanly, with your voluntary agreement. Not just a workaround we found to avoid dealing with you directly. He slid a proposal across the table, considerably shorter than the one Calloway had drafted in July. We're offering a formal, limited license, not a sale. A defined and modest allocation, fairly compensated, with your right to revoke it if we ever violate the terms. You keep the deed, you keep control. We get just enough to make 12 units work instead of 40. Nora read it slowly, twice, the way her grandmother had taught her to read everything now. She found nothing in it that made her uneasy, the way the first 2 offers had. 12 units, she said. Not 40. Not 40, Fenner agreed. The mountain can't really support 40 anyway, if we're honest about it. I think somewhere in the last 3 months I stopped wanting to build something dishonest, even before it stopped being possible. He looked out the diner window toward the ridge, where Sorrel Mountain rose green and steady above the town. Your grandmother did something I don't fully understand yet. Ms. Vance. She looked 40 years down a road nobody else could see. Made sure whoever walked it after her wouldn't get run over by people like me. I've been in this business 18 years. I've never once had a landowner beat me clean. On paper, with nothing but patience and a deed nobody bothered to read. I find I don't mind losing to her nearly as much as I expected to. Nora signed the license 2 weeks later, in Ash's office. With Hollis beside her again and Deb Sizemore's office recording the final paperwork the same week. A modest, defined, revocable allocation, paying her $11,000 a year for the length of the agreement. Controlled entirely on her terms, it protected the spring's flow and the mountain's quiet, the way Opal would have wanted. It still let a smaller, honester version of somebody's ambition find a way to exist on the ridge below her. Nora used some of that first year's payment, plus some of the smaller settlement Century Ridge eventually paid to formally close out its original, larger claim. She did 3 things with it, that fall. She paid off the last of her own small debts, the kind that had followed her since the temp agency years dried up. She bought a truck that didn't have a check engine light glowing permanent orange on the dash, and she put the rest, every remaining dollar of it, into reopening the cabin as something more than a place to sleep. She called it Opal's Spring. She painted the name herself on a board Hollis milled from a fallen oak on the property. She hung it from the porch eave the week before Thanksgiving. It wasn't a business exactly, not at first. Just a covered gathering spot near the spring access. With 2 picnic tables and a hand pump for water, anyone in the county was welcome to fill a jug from. Free, the way Opal herself would have wanted it. The way a woman once cut out of a feed store by her own father had spent her whole life since, making sure nobody else in her family ever had to feel that particular kind of nothing again. She kept the free water pump running through the winter, breaking ice off the spigot most cold mornings before her diner shift. Word spread through the county, the way good news sometimes does. Slower than bad news, but steadier once it takes hold. Families driving the back way between towns started stopping to fill jugs and let their kids stretch their legs by the picnic tables. An old widower 2 farms over left a bundle of firewood by the sign 1 week. Unsigned, the way the first strangers 20 had come. Nora understood finally that this was simply how the mountain paid its debts. Quietly, hand to hand, nobody keeping score out loud. Patsy Duncan came up one Sunday in January with a thermos of her own coffee. She sat at one of the picnic tables like she'd been coming there for years instead of weeks. She told Nora, watching steam rise off the spring in the cold air, that Opal used to say the exact same thing. Tipping $1 on a $2 check, 40 years straight. Long after she could have easily afforded to tip more. She told me once it wasn't about the dollar, Patsy said. Said the amount never mattered half as much as making sure somebody, somewhere, remembered you as kind long after you were gone. Guess she was building more than one kind of inheritance her whole life. Deb Sizemore's mother, before she passed, used to say Opal Vance tipped $1 on every check for 40 years, just so the girls at the diner would remember her kindly, even when $1 tip was an insult to the math of it. Nora thought about that a great deal that fall, standing at the spring some evenings after the caretaker's cabin work was done. Garrett gone home to whatever quieter life he was building now. She understood, finally and completely, what her grandmother had been trying to teach her the whole time, long before either of them knew a lawyer would ever slide a $1 deed across a table. It was never about $1. It was never about 4 million either. It was about a woman making sure the girl who kept showing up would someday stand on solid, provable, legally recorded ground. The girl who never once asked what was in it for her. In a family that had spent generations deciding who deserved something and who didn't, and get to be the one who finally decided differently. On the first cold morning of December, Nora stood on the mended porch of the cabin they'd once handed her as a joke. Frost silvered the grass down toward Polly's spring. She thought about the brass key still hanging on its shoelace around her neck, worth nothing now as a key, worth everything as a thing her grandmother's hands had once touched and hidden, and trusted her, eventually, to find. She poured 2 cups of coffee, black, the way Opal always took hers. She carried one down the mended steps to where Garrett was already at work on the caretaker's roof. She handed it to him without a word. For once, neither of them needed to say anything at all. Spring turned into summer on Sorrel Mountain. The maples went from sorrel green to deep, heavy summer colour. The spring never slowed, never rose too high, never once stopped its steady work. The caretaker's cabin got a new roof. The picnic tables by the spring access needed a second coat of stain. Nora found she no longer counted the money in the coffee can every night out of fear. She counted it now and then out of simple habit. The way you check a thing you love just to make sure it's still there. Hollis Pruitt turned 72 that June. Nora threw him a small party on the mended porch. Just herself and Patsy and Deb Sizemore, and a few of the regulars from the Sorrel Cafe. Hollis sat in the best chair, looking for once like a man with nowhere else he needed to be. 40 years I carried that sentence around, he told the small gathering, raising a paper cup of lemonade like it was something finer. Opal made me write it twice, so no lawyer could pretend not to see it. I used to think that was just an old woman being particular. Turns out it was the whole plan, start to finish, and she never once needed to raise her voice to make it work. To Opal, Patsy said. Everyone on the porch raised their cups. Down below them the spring ran on the way it always had, indifferent to toasts, indifferent to anniversaries, indifferent to everything else. The humans up on that mountain had decided mattered. Deb Sizemore came to that little party too. She'd never once been invited to anything at Garrett's house in 30 years of processing his paperwork downtown. She brought a pie apple still warm from her own oven, and she set it on the porch rail like it belonged there. Your grandmother used to bring me pie every Christmas, Deb said, cutting the first slice for Hollis. Not because she had to, just because she liked seeing people eat something good. She looked out at the spring, at the mended porch, at the whole small hard-won world Nora had built out of a $1 joke. Feels right, bringing one back up here, Nora thought, watching Deb hand out slices to people who'd once only known Opal Vance as a name on old paperwork, that this was exactly the kind of afternoon her grandmother would have wanted. Small, quiet, full of people who had shown up for the right reasons, and nobody keeping score of who owed who anything at all. Nora kept working the breakfast shift at the Sorrel Cafe through that summer too. She liked the work, and Patsy Duncan had become something closer to family than half the people who actually shared her blood. She used the annual license payments to slowly restore Opal Spring into something more permanent. A small covered pavilion by autumn, a proper well house by the following spring. Always careful never to touch the spring's flow itself. Always careful to keep it exactly as free and exactly as public as her grandmother would have wanted. The spring ran on below them, exactly the way it always had. Patient, indifferent, and entirely legally hers.